I guess I will react to this. It's Ben Shapiro, so I expect it to be a very interesting or difficult video. Damn, 500 votes, fake news, Mellow Mike rigging the polls. Yikes. Yes, give us that crunchy leftist audio. Well, first we need to debunk this short video by Computer Angel 2 titled Ben Shapiro Audio, but it's coming from a locker.
If you have a right to property, that's only because the government is letting you have property. If you have a right to free speech, it's only because the government allows you to speak freely. But all rights, in the end, only come from the collective. They only come from government. There are no pre-existing individual rights in a state of nature or anything like that. Negative rights are rights that you have from the intervention of others. Positive rights are rights that you have.
Well, I guess that's more or less actually the summary of this whole 10-minute video. So I have not reviewed this video before. The topic is positive and negative rights. The basic concept of a positive right is that you have a right to do something, and the negative right is that you cannot be prevented from doing something. So a classic negative right would be the right to freedom of speech. No one can stop you from, say, like going outside on a public street and speaking about things that you wish within certain limitations about like public safety. And a positive right would be a right to, say, healthcare. So you have a right to be given services that would keep you in good health. The classic conservative argument is that negative rights are that you get, as Ben Shapiro said, from the state of nature, that everyone starts with the ability to speak freely, and that therefore those are the only rights that you should have. I think this is basically just an appeal to nature. Just because that's what is doesn't mean that's what ought to be. I think positive rights are a useful way to think about the world, because if your goal is not merely if your goal is not merely to ensure that people are free from state intervention, free from coercion, but actually to ensure that people are as able as possible to pursue their goals, which you can frame in terms of like human flourishing or actually using their freedom to pursue their goals, then I think that you need positive freedom. I think that it is impossible to have to meaningfully participate in most societies if you don't have good health, if you don't have meaningful access to education. I think that de facto, your exercise of those negative rights is contingent on you having a strong positive right to life and a strong positive right to like well-being and a whole bunch of other positive rights. So that's my basic thesis. And I guess we will be reviewing Ben Shapiro taking me down for 10 minutes. I'm going to try and make this quick. We'll see much better audio. It was pretty funny that it was Ben Shapiro. Ben Shabibo, if he was a leftist, that is a far better way to consume him. Yes, hypothetically, let's say we stop the count. The natural state of man is dying at 23 from a cut on my pinky. Technically, I think the average person died around 40. So, not good. And Prim gang. All right. We will be listening to Ben Shapiro from IDW Clips, the intellectual dark web, folks.
So your freedoms are under assault from motivated thinkers on every side. You have a group of people who believe that because there are problems in your life or in their life, that they get to assault other people's rights, and they get to redistribute the products of your labor. They get to invade your rights on behalf of their own. And the most extreme version of this is the identity politics that has suddenly infused large portions of the left.
Why is he going to make it an identity politics? Do I have to listen to this? So I think the basic thesis of this argument is to enforce a positive right does require coercion. So a negative right does not require coercion. It's the absence of coercion. To enforce a positive right does require coercion. In that, for example, you'd have to like raise taxes so that you could pay for healthcare, and that raising of taxes is forcibly taking away people's income and giving it to other people. The argument for it, classically, is that yes, you are reducing everyone's individual freedom a little bit by imposing taxes, but you're also radically increasing everyone's freedom by giving them, say, healthcare. And so even though there's a freedom reduction, it is outweighed by the freedom increase, the classic sort of utilitarian way of thinking about rights and freedoms. Let's see how he brings identity politics into this.
It's actually generated a sort of response politics of identity politics on behalf of the right. But this basic logic...
The party of personal responsibility. Here, let me just play it back. I'll let him play it.
This is the identity politics that has suddenly infused large portions of the left. It's actually generated a sort of response politics of identity politics on behalf of the right.
Why is it that the party of personal responsibility can never take fucking responsibility for the fact that they grew white nationalism, white supremacy, and other racist elements within their own party? Why does it always have to be that, like, the left, the big mean left, was so scary and they did idpol, and now some people did idpol in response? No, people didn't get so mad at SJWs that they became white nationalists. They became white nationalists because they were fed a huge, like, smorgasbord of right-wing conspiracy theories and propaganda about race and about the nature of the United States. It's just such bullshit. People, I fucking hate this.
But this basic logic suggests that because you are a member of a particular victimized group in American society, other people's rights don't matter the same way that your rights matter. And what this creates on the part of the left is the intersectional hierarchy. This idea that if you're a member of a more victimized group, you have more rights by nature than people who are members of less victimized groups, because we have to somehow rectify the imbalances of America's history. So on the intersectionality scale, for the left, it goes something like this in terms of the folks who are most victimized in American society. It goes LGBT folks, and then black folks, and then Hispanics, and then women, and then Asians, and then Jews, and then right here at the bottom, white folks. And this matters because...
Did he just put Jews above white people? I feel like a lot of idpol people would put Jews, like, way at the bottom. Like, there are some left-wing people. I've seen a lot of black nationalists do, like, very anti-Semitic stuff, or whatever. The whole idea that, like, so I, as an intersectionalist, agree that we should try to undo, like, we should try to rectify the wrongs of history. We shouldn't do it. Some people will say it for different reasons. They will say that we actually should, like, rectify history, as Ben Shapiro said. Instead, I think that I want a society based on, like, equity, where you are not born wealthy or poor because of your race. You are not born wealthy or poor because of your gender, and so on. Where using something like Rawls's veil of ignorance, you would think as if you had not been born, what type of society would I want to be born into if I didn't know where I'd be born? And rationally, I don't think any person should want a racist society, because what if you were born as a black person? What if you were born as a woman in a sexist society? The classic argument here is that we build a more equitable society because it is morally just, not because we're fixing the wrongs of the past. I think there's no need to bring this sort of, like, rectifying history into it at all to make very strong moral arguments here. And why do we fix it in addition to, like, all the idea that we want, like, a morally equal society? Well, it's also if you're just purely self-interested, it is a better society to be more equal. We have a huge amount of evidence that necessarily racist hiring reduces productivity. We have a lot of evidence that higher inequality societies have reduced productivity. In general, you would want a society that is more tolerant, not only for the benefit of, like, the hypothetical moral agent, but you'd want it personally because it probably makes your life better off, unless you tend to be of, like, the extremely rich class, in which you might be somewhat worse off. I'm using people as a means to an end. All right, Nadja, thank you for the Deontology comment.
Because for the left, this identity politics hierarchy...
What do you search? Oh, if you search, if you go to the SRF, which you can get by typing !SRF in chat, it should link you the website, and then there should be a meta-analysis or meta-study on income inequality and growth. I think you can just find that if you search income inequality. You should be able to find that. I believe the estimate there is that a 10% increase of inequality, which includes both wealth and income inequality in this meta-study, was associated with a 3% decrease in growth, which is not enormous, right? You could double income inequality and only reduce growth by... what's that, 30%? It would only reduce it by a third. So you'd go from, like, 3% GDP growth to like 2% GDP growth. It's not enormous, but it's substantial, right? 3% versus 2% over 100 years is very, very large. Yeah.
Hierarchy decides how seriously we ought to take your views. If you are lower on the intersectional politics hierarchy, then we don't have to take your view particularly seriously. In fact, you should shut up and you should listen. You should acknowledge your privilege. If you are at the upper end of that echelon, then, of course, you should be able to not only say whatever you want, but you should also be respected for what you have to say, no matter how stupid it is.
I agree. We should never give people respect for what they say, regardless of how stupid it is. For example, Ben Shapiro. All of what he's saying here is really, really stupid. I think in a very basic moral understanding, or a very basic understanding of, like of applications of ethics to this, unless you are, like, a deontologist, which a lot of right-wingers are, where they think that, like, any coercion always bad, which I just don't think makes any moral sense.
And if your rights are violated and you're on the bottom end of that scale, well, that's just because that's the way the world has to work in order to fix the problems that we've had historically in the country.
I also hate this meme, like this idea that, like, they've constructed this, like, really rigid totem pole where, like, the gays are at the top and you can't even critique it. It's just so bullshit. Half of the country voted for Trump. Ben Shapiro gets enormous crowds. You are free to critique it all the damn time. And it's not like we've, like, given all the money to the gays. Gays I think gays get slightly higher than average income, mostly because of gay men getting slightly higher than average, and gay women only get slightly below average. But like gays are not this like enormously wealthy class controlling politics. We didn't, as a society, like give them all the money. Right now, we want to give them money to like rectify things or to make a more equal society, depending on how you want to think about it. But we don't want to like give them so much money that now they are the true oppressors, which is I think was implied by this.
Well, to understand the current assault on individual rights that's taking place across the country, we first have to understand that there are two different visions of how rights work.
Thick Boy said leftists still don't like Dave Rubin, who, by Ben Shapiro's logic, at the LGBT class, we should all be respecting. Fuck that. People just disrespect conservatives because you're stupid. God damn.
There's the negative rights vision, and there's the positive rights vision. The negative rights vision suggests that rights come from God. You, as an individual human being, have rights that you would have in a state of nature, without a government present, without any sort of overarching power. You would have these rights. You have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to your own property. You have the right to freedom of speech. You have the right to bear arms. All of these things exist in a state of nature because they allow you to protect yourselves and own what it is that you do. These are rights that come as a manifestation of you being an individual of worth, of you being made in God's image.
So the religious imagery, I think, is obviously stupid, but that's somewhat outside the context of the video. I just want to talk about the moral argument. So you do start with certain freedoms in nature, but this has been something that people have noted in like moral, in discussions of morality and politics for a very long time. Most of these rights only exist if someone is there to protect you from someone else coercing you. What does your freedom of speech matter if someone can kill you for disagreeing with them? What does your right to property matter if someone can kill you and take the land? You need some sort of agent to protect that property. One of the economists that I constantly refer to is Darren Acemoglu, that's how it's spelled, A-C-E Moglu, and one of the really big things that he proves is that modern property rights only emerged in modern liberal democracies. And so I shouldn't say only emerged, that well-functioning, highly economically efficient and economically useful property rights only emerged in modern liberal democracies, where not only was the state willing to enforce your property rights, but they were willing to build up an economic system that would allow you to actually use those property rights for economic gain. So even from a purely capitalist perspective, it is just bullshit to say that you think that you have the right to property in nature. You need a state to force other people to respect your right to property. To some degree, I would argue that every right that we usually consider a negative right is actually a partial positive right. Instead of thinking about things as negative or positive in this binary, generally we should think about it as a gradient. There are things which require a lot of state coercion to enforce and those that require very little state coercion to enforce. And as you move further and further away from things that you as an individual can do and towards things that as a society must do to like respect you, like say property rights, the harder and harder it is to do it without state coercion. And therefore the closer and closer you get to positive rights. So property rights end up becoming pretty close towards, not pretty close, they end up moving towards positive rights because you need state coercion to actually make them function. There's a really, well, I won't go into that too much. We already said a lot.
Then there's the positive rights view of how rights work. And this is the idea that rights come from government. There are no rights outside of government. There's a big collective. And that collective gets to tell you what your rights are. And therefore, if that collective decides that your rights are not as important as somebody else's rights, then they can simply redistribute the rights. They can circumscribe the rights. They can prevent those rights from being evenly applied or available to everyone.
Yeah, that's like how democracy works. And we would like well-functioning democracies to not take away people's rights as much as possible. That's the whole point of designing well-functioning democratic systems, where, for example, you don't support people like Donald Trump who tend to destroy the democratic norms and the well-functioning democracy there. I agree that the collective can take away your rights, but what's the alternative? Unless the alternative is some sort of like radical return to nature where everyone lives like in isolation and no one can stop you, you have to live in a society with some coercion. The best thing you can do is try and build a society where that coercion is as small as possible and used towards the best ends as possible. That might sound odd from like a socialist. The idea is that I want to achieve my socialist ends while using as little force as necessary to get people to align with those ends. To give people universal healthcare, I don't need to literally conscript doctors and force them to give healthcare. I can just pay people to be doctors, which is no more coercive than the private market doing that. If you think the private market is the state of nature, as Ben almost certainly does. In short, I think that the goal is to preserve these sorts of rights while harming as few people as possible. But the mere fact that they have the possibility of taking away your rights does not mean that they will. Instead, the goal should be recognizing that they're taking away of your rights sometimes gives you more rights most of the time, and your goal should be to limit their taking away of the rights and maximize their giving of the rights. You should want to minimize how much the government coerces upon you and maximizes how much the government gives you in return, like say well-functioning property rights if you're Ben Shapiro.
The U.S. Constitution is based on negative rights. The Constitution of South Africa, or the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, those are based on positive rights. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by the way.
Interestingly, before he gets into this, people have actually changed their minds on this. We used to think that the U.S. Constitution was mostly negative rights, but more recently, the Supreme Court has been ruling that your right to a fair trial requires a positive right to a lawyer. Not everyone can afford a lawyer, and the state isn't the only one preventing you from getting a good lawyer. Instead, courts have been increasingly ruling that the state has a duty to provide you a right to a lawyer, and that's part of requiring that they give you a fair and speedy trial. You can't have justice unless the state gives you certain rights to access justice. This is the same argument for positive rights in stuff like healthcare. You can't meaningfully access freedom of speech unless you're there to live to actually say it. So this, I think, is the argument for why natural rights and positive rights naturally interlink, unless you think that there's some sort of weird binary between the two, which I don't think there is whatsoever.
The way suggests the notorious RBG's.
And then Naja mentions Miranda rights. Yes, another modern example of positive rights, that you don't merely have the lack of state coercion on you, that the state actually has to provide you certain things to understand what state coercion is happening upon you. Yeah.
Says the U.S. Constitution is a worse constitution than the South African Constitution because she is a devotee of positive rights. This would be right to health care, right to education, right to health. The way you can tell the difference between a negative right and a positive right, just in practice, is whether...
The way you can tell the difference between a negative and a positive right is the United States, where housing is not a right, and we have maybe, I want to say it's like, what, 250,000 long-term homeless, and Finland, where housing is a right, and they have 500.
A right that is articulated requires somebody else's labor or time in order to affect...
I think those aren't the right numbers. I want to say it's 1 million long-term homeless in the United States, or it's either 1 million or 500,000 in the United States, and in Finland it's 500. But also, some people say Finland's much smaller. It's like 1 in 11,000 in Finland, but it's like 1 in 300 in the United States. It's not that rare in the United States to have like long-term lack of access to housing. It's pretty bad.
So I have a right to bear arms. That doesn't require anything of you. I have a right to self-defense, freedom of speech. I have a right to my own property. These
I would say some of those, like the rights to literally own a firearm, are those that tend to be very close to negative rights. But then as you get closer to stuff like property or people respecting your firearm and not taking it from you, you get closer and closer to needing state coercion, the classic Acemoglu argument.
Require nothing of you other than you don't get to invade that right. A right to housing, by contrast, suggests that I have to provide you housing. A right to health care suggests I have to provide you health care.
Yes.
And that if I am unwilling to provide you these things, then I have violated the social compact and I can be forced to at the point of gun.
So again, this is the whole idea that you don't need to literally conscript doctors. You could just pay them. People are generally willing to do these jobs if you pay them. That's why they're doing them in the current market. What we do is we tax you, and then we use some of that tax money to pay a doctor. And if you don't want to be a doctor, guess what you can do? Leave the profession. If Ben doesn't think that entering or leaving a profession right now under capitalism is coercion, they should not think that entering or leaving a profession, if it's paid by the public, is any different. They could argue that taxation is coercion, but that is a decidedly different argument than arguing that we have to force doctors at gunpoint to give people health care.
You can see how these differences between negative and positive...
Oh, and one thing, Znapper mentioned that Finland has 4,500 homeless people. Specifically, I'm talking about long-term homeless people. Finland has two definitions of homeless. One is those who are like living with friends, family on the couches. They are without a permanent home, but they're not homeless, if that makes any sense. They're not without shelter. And then there's the long-term homeless, which is like on the street, which is how the United States defines it. Like our homeless count is just people who are long-term homeless. We don't even count the people who are on beds in their friends' houses. We don't even count that. Finland does, because they, in 1987, set a goal to eliminate homelessness. We don't.
Positive rights are manifest in today's politics. And it's no surprise that the Constitution has come under attack from these positive rights advocates, largely springing from the left. Now, how do these positive rights intersect with the identity politics I was talking about early? Well, the left has basically suggested that positive rights are not to be equally applied. It's not that everybody has a right to housing or everybody has a right to health care. It's that everybody has a right to housing and everybody has a right to health care, And if we have to restrict somebody else's rights in order to guarantee that universal positive right, then we will pick the groups that have historically benefited from the American system, and we will penalize those groups.
I think that very few people who you will see arguing for genuine positive rights, like housing for everyone in the United States, will then say, I want housing for everyone, but I mostly want housing for black people. And if that means that I house black people before white people, yeah, kick the white people out. Generally, universalist programs tend to be pretty like race neutral or class neutral or whatever. It's just like give everyone housing. I shouldn't say class neutral, identity neutral. Necessarily, they can't be class neutral because generally it's only poor people that can't afford housing. So that was a misstep.
So identity politics is really a redistributionist way of thinking about how rights are supposed to be manifest in American politics. Here's how all of this plays out in terms of your rights. The Bill of Rights is filled with rights. These are all negative rights. All of the rights in the Bill of Rights, with possible exception of rights counsel, maybe.
Ooh, he said it. I was right. How did I know it? Folks, it's my massive brain.
All of these are negative rights. They are rights that you have in a state of nature and that are not guaranteed to you by the government, except by the government guaranteeing nobody else can invade those rights.
I wonder what Ben Shapiro thinks about Twitter censoring people's freedom of speech. Does he think that if every platform online eliminated his account and banned people who platformed him, that he would still have meaningful free speech? Because I think the whole modern conservative argument of free speech is actually very contingent on a belief in positive rights, that you don't have a meaningful right to freedom of speech unless you have a right to a platform, and that those who own those platforms have to deliver you some level of platforming. I think it's very hard to understand that unless you come from a positive rights conception, that freedom of speech doesn't just mean that you aren't stopped from being spoken by the government, that the government doesn't like literally stop you from speaking, but that also too, you need a meaningful way to talk to people, to communicate to people, and that non-state actors can also force you to not be able to talk to people. I think it's very hard to understand that without a positive right conception. Naja Fan says the right to vote is a positive right. I guess technically, I don't know. I don't think the Bill of Rights actually explicitly says you have right to vote. I want to say that's like the 14th or 15th that gives everyone born in the United States citizenship and right to vote. Those could also be separate. It's been a while since I've read the Constitution, so feel free to call me out. But in short, I don't think the Bill of Rights proper actually has a right to vote. But regardless, I would actually argue, again, right to vote is one of those things that's positive, as we saw in the American South. People can take away your right to vote. The government can take away your vote via like poll taxes. But even without poll taxes, people can take away your right to vote via coercion. One of the ways the Nazis coerced people to not vote for leftist parties is they would literally send the stormtroopers into leftist neighborhoods and they would beat people up near the polling stations. You can be intimidated by non-state actors. You have a positive right to vote, which often requires like state force to make sure that other people don't stop you from voting. Really simple.
And all of those rights are currently under assault from a left that wishes to rewrite that social compact. Freedom of religion, under the First Amendment, obviously is being assaulted right now by folks who believe that rights are variable. And freedom of religion suggests that I get to practice my religion as I see fit, so long as I'm not harming you. But what the left does is they say, well, your definition of harm isn't broad enough. So if you run a business and you don't...
Yeah, and what's wrong with that? What? Of course you can disagree with the definition of harm. That's not necessarily disagreeing with the right to religion. What?
Don't wish to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding, you are somehow invading my rights. Well, I'm not. In any sort of negative rights world, I'm obviously not invading your rights because I have no obligation to bake you a cake. It's my cake, it's my shop. I don't have a right to... You don't have a right to my cake.
Actually, on this one, I generally don't lean towards the liberal position. I am of the view... Here, one moment, let me look at my cat.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
You are brilliant, beautiful stream. I don't know if I call myself brilliant. I don't think the stream's that pretty, but thank you. Like the intimidators that Trump wanted at the polls, yeah, that almost certainly would have had negative consequences. People mentioned how in the census, just including a question about citizenship could dissuade people from like saying they were Hispanic. It's not hard to understand how private agents can have chilling effects on freedom of speech. I don't think it's hard to understand that at all. What's up, Opie? Let's do Bed Wars in 20 minutes. Sound good? Love Blue. Yeah, yes, please. Let's see. Oh, and they were mentioning the right to the freedom of speech and the cake. I actually somewhat agree with the conservative take on this one. I don't think that you should be forced to serve other people regardless of their request. I do think that you should be forced to provide goods to everyone regardless of request. And so I know that's a somewhat legalistic way of approaching this. My take is that if you are providing a good which does not matter based on the identity of the person that you're providing it to, so the classic examples would be like a hotel or like a loaf of bread at the supermarket. These do not matter. A gay man can buy a hotel, a black woman can buy a loaf of bread at the supermarket, and their identity is totally irrelevant to the purchase of that good. I do think that it is somewhat reasonable to allow people to restrict who they serve for service here, meaning that you provide something which is contingent on the nature of the request. So if someone asks that you provide a wedding cake specifically with like 2 gay people on top, I could see that as being a problem. But if someone requests a wedding cake and it has nothing to do with gayness, it's just a wedding cake, just a blanket wedding cake, then you should be forced to provide that. So in short, I do believe in protected classes. It's simply where they apply, because the classic counter argument has been, let's say that there were a Jewish baker, and let's imagine that we added political identity to protected classes because we don't want people to be discriminated based on political identity. Or we could even work with it for religion. Let's say it's like a Jewish baker, and someone wants them to bake like a cake celebrating, I don't know, like Satan or something. We might consider that this would be a violation of their religious rights to force them to bake this cake. A Jewish person, if we were talking about political identity, of forcing a Jewish person to bake a cake with a swastika on it. So my concern is that I think that a blanket requirement that you serve people regardless of their request could lead to situations where you are genuinely infringing personal, like artistic freedom, for example, to choose who you serve and who you do not. However, my suggestion again is that if the object that you're providing is totally identity, not totally, if it is meaningless what the person's identity is, then you should be forced to provide that. So the Jewish cake baker should be forced to require, like even if the neo-Nazi group comes in through the door and they say, hey, we want a cake and we want, I don't know, some like red, white, and black icing as well. Because those things are totally irrelevant of their ideology, you should be forced to provide it to them. But as soon as they say, take that icing and make a swastika, then it's unacceptable. That would be my take. Can I post the link to your Twitch stream? Sure. Here you go. Oh, that's Twitter. Wrong one. I don't know. I know that some people disagree with me on this one. I worry about the genuine imposition on people. Whatever. I know that was a big aside. I think that Ben Shapiro has a slightly correct take on this, but I think that his overall take is absolutely incorrect. You should be required to do stuff like, say, provide marriage certificates, provide cakes in general to people regardless of their sexuality. I think that is absolutely true. I think that the reason that conservatives pick on this is just because they want to act the victim without realizing that, by and large, the massive victims of like bigotry in the society, the massive victims of like state coercion in the society do not tend to be like religious white Christians. It tends to be the gay, it tends to be the black, and so on. I think it appeals to the victimhood narrative. Stuff like a gay wedding cake is so incredibly rare that it's just meaningless, except from a very technical legal argument. Do I think Ben Shapiro is a grifter?
Wake up, liberal.
I haven't watched enough Ben Shapiro to evaluate that. I will hold for now. Maybe after a few more, maybe after I've watched another 6 hours and I've melted my brains, I can take it on it. All right, I will keep listening. I'm going to try and keep this one reasonably short.
You don't have a right to my labor, you don't have a right to my time. But the left has decided that freedom of religion must be quashed, but specifically religions that have had historical dominance in the United States, which is one of the reasons that you see
I don't think this is true. I think that the people who want the gay wedding cake to have been forced to be baked would have also required it to be baked at like a Muslim bakery or a Jewish bakery. I'm virtually certain of this. I don't think that this whole like totem pole of like, oh, we only want Christians to be oppressed for the gay new like super class. I think that's just bullshit.
All of this focus on the part of social activists on the left, focusing in on religious Christians and almost none focusing on religious Muslims, for example. If you go to a religious Muslim bakery, they also... The
reason for that is that Muslims are like 1% of the United States population, but Christians are like 2/3, like 2/3 to 3/4. Of course. What?
Will probably tell you that they're not interested in baking a cake for your same-sex wedding. But you haven't seen any talk about that, specifically because Muslims in the United States rank higher on the intersectional scale than Christians do. Well, the same thing holds true when it comes to rights like freedom of speech and of the press. The right to freedom of speech only applies under certain circumstances according to the left, because some speech is harmful, some speech is violence. Hate speech must be banned. Now, nothing in the Constitution says any of this. Speech is speech, violence is violence. There is no such category under the Constitution, or really in thought, as hate speech. We all know that there's such a thing as hateful speech, but that's not the same thing as saying that you, a subjective human being, get to ban other people or use violence to stop other people from talking. Yet you see that the left has engaged in...
So on the free speech thing, I tend actually to take the more pro-free speech side on this one. I don't tend to think that it is great to censor speech. However, I have been changing my opinion on hate speech because previously I found that there was a paucity of evidence for stuff like trigger warnings or for banning hate speech. I think that now I found a reasonable, strong amount of evidence that particularly banning speech, which is associated with getting people on the gap between like just a right, for example, between like just like a conservative Muslim, a conservative Christian, getting them to go the extra step and get into like a radical right-wing organization. That those do seem to work. There's evidence that when ISIS recruiters were censored on Twitter and Facebook and so on, that it dipped ISIS recruitment numbers. And there's a lot of other related evidence for that. So I think specifically, I am willing to say that the state should have maybe a role in censoring speech which genuinely seems likely to lead to violence, which I would argue actually is the same thing that he is saying. I guarantee that Ben Shapiro is willing to say that like free speech was set, which the classic legal exception in the United States is that free speech, which is involved in the perpetration of a crime, is not covered under freedom of speech. Like if you're saying, I want to kill that man, like you're a mafia boss and you're like, I want to go kill Bobby or something, that is not freedom of speech. Your speech is not protected. The state can prosecute you for that. And so that's the classic like incitement to violence sort of thing. And so I would say that extending that one step further and talking about not direct incitement to violence, but second order incitement to violence, which is like getting people involved in hate groups, like active hate groups, not just like the Republican Party or something, like literal like hate groups like the KKK or ISIS. I think that there is good evidence that this does work. So I have changed my opinion on that one. How do you feel about incitement of violence potentially being amended to including hate speech? I guess that's more or less the argument that I said, actually. So I think we agree entirely, thick boy. Thick SDL, thick boy, total unity in action.
In a sort of mob politics where they grin and laugh when people's rights are shut down. If I go to Berkeley, then you'll see riots, literal riots, if I go to Berkeley, because my speech is violence. When I went to Berkeley, requiring some 500 police officers, 600 police officers.
How many police officers do you think there were at the U.S. Capitol? 500 police officers for a Ben Shapiro rally where like 100 students are going to show up and protest? Come on, man.
The place. People outside were literally chanting, speech is violence, which of course it is not. But
speech can be violence. I don't know that I would say Ben Shapiro's speech most of the time is violence, though there was that one terrorist in Canada, I want to say in Quebec, like the mosque shooting. I'm pretty sure he was tied to Ben Shapiro, but I don't think that Ben Shapiro's speech overall is likely to have that radicalizing effect. So I don't think that Ben Shapiro would be close to being covered by this sort of legislation if it were to exist. Because Ben Shapiro is not getting people involved in like the Proud Boys. No. The New Zealand thing that you're thinking about, they were inspired by Pole and like more right-wing stuff. There was a Quebec mosque shooter scoured Twitter for Trump right-wing figures before attack. He followed Ben Shapiro and he really liked Ben Shapiro's stuff. This is the guy I'm thinking of. The Quebec mosque shooting. Yeah. So I would say that these guys are they are like third order hate speech incitement. So I don't think that they would fall under this. I'm talking about directly getting people into stuff like the Proud Boys, into stuff like organizations like that. Yeah. Because otherwise I think that you'd end up censoring so much speech that it would genuinely have a chilling effect. And I think that the consequence there would be much greater than the reduction of terrorism. Yeah. As Leah says, the Quebec guy was a Shapiro fan. Yep. But the basic problem with that is that because Shapiro is such a large figure, it's sort of like how, like, imagine that I had 1 million subscribers, right? How likely would it be that if it's 1 in 10 million people do terrorism or something, right? Then there's about a 1 in 10 chance that I would have a subscriber who's gonna do terrorism. I just think by the very nature of Ben Shapiro being an enormous figure, there'll be some figures who like him and who do terrorism. What we specifically need to see a link is between someone consuming Ben Shapiro and getting into these like hate groups. And so I don't think that Ben Shapiro would like fall into that whatsoever. But I do think there is reasonable evidence that second order incitement to violence, often called like hate speech, of an extreme nature, like getting people involved in groups, could absolutely be covered with good reason under the U.S. Constitution. Because the classic, I know this is like a long ramble, and I apologize for that, but the classic way that when is the state allowed to censor speech in U.S. constitutional law, the classic way is that the U.S. is able to censor speech when it is injurious to public safety, when it would harm public safety. And so I think that someone who's actively getting people involved in hate groups, we could argue probably reasonably well, is actually injuring public safety, or at least the perception of public safety. So, yeah.
If the goal is to equate speech with violence, then as soon as speech is violence, we can shut down violence. Government has a role in preventing violence. So if my speech is violence or causes violence, then we can simply shut down my speech. This is ugly stuff. And you see...
So I just want to be clear, like, Ben Shapiro is by no means like just an innocent victim in all of this. Ben Shapiro said that Palestinians live in garbage, right? Ben Shapiro has been like a virulent right-wing figure for a very long time. He has very little qualms about using like the most disgusting language towards his victims. So I have very little, I don't think that any of this is like, I think that he's trying to play up the victim status, and he is not by any means like this, what is it, like innocent Hosanna or whatever? He is by no means innocent. However, again, I don't think that there's an argument that there's a direct link between like Ben Shapiro and violence, but there might be with more right-wing people like Yiannopoulos or Molyneux, for example.
Fortunately, this mindset becoming quite prominent across the country. I'm not just talking about governmental attempts to shut down speech at this point. I'm talking about an attitude of free speech that actually allows us to have a fulsome conversation about the issues. You saw this manifest when it came to the Me Too movement. This idea that men had nothing to say about Me Too. Sit down and shut up, you're men, you don't know anything. Or abortion. Sit down and shut up, you're men, you don't know anything.
Weren't there a whole bunch of people who came out in Me Too who are like male victims of sexual assault? I understand that, like, again, I'm sure there's some people who say the dumb stuff that Ben is saying, but overall, there have been, I literally just like 2 weeks ago read an article in The Atlantic about, who was it? Who was the guy from Minnesota? Al Franken. I read a retrospective about Al Franken, which looked at whether like he was correct, and it was written by a woman author, and it generally investigated the claims of sexual assault against Al Franken, and it said that while he might have been like sexually inappropriate, probably he wasn't a sexual assaulter or sexual harasser. And so like unless the culture of freedom of speech has radically changed in the, when was this posted? 2018. Unless freedom of speech has radically changed in the last 2 years, this is just bullshit. People are very willing to question victims of sexual assault. If anything, I think the experience of victims of sexual assault, or I guess alleged victims of sexual assault, is almost universally negative. People hate on victims of sexual assault. They ask like, what were you wearing? What did you do to get this? While there is an outpouring of love, there's also an outpouring of like extreme and often sexist skepticism towards particularly women. But then also there's even like homophobic often sentiment towards men. Like, oh, did you like it? Did you enjoy it? Or this idea that men can't be raped. I don't know. This is just, I hate this. Franken got slandered. Yeah, I think that the example of Franken, it seems like Franken, it was taken as too serious, as beyond what it actually was. Actually, you know what? This is so funny. If Ben Shapiro had said this in 2020, you know he would have had to point to is fucking Joe Biden. Because all of the Joe Biden supporters looked at the story that, who was the lady who was the woman who introduced the main, allegation of sexual harassment against Joe Biden? Tara Reade. A huge portion of people looked at the story of Tara Reade and they disbelieved her, right? Did the culture of speech change so radically that half of the country was willing to ignore the story of Tara Reade over that of a decrepit old white man who apparently is at the bottom of the scale? I don't know. I think this is just, again, this is just victimhood blaming. Not victimhood blaming. This is trying to posture yourself as a victim.
Well, we can't have a conversation if you're simply going to assume that I can't understand you because of dint of...
Oh, and to be clear, I from what I've read about the Tara Reade situation, it doesn't appear that her claims of like sexual assault are credible, but her claims of sexual harassment might be quite credible. It might be very much the case that Biden is genuinely too, what's the word, like frisky? I think someone said that in chat. He is genuinely too willing to like touch women. He's not respectful of women's boundaries. I don't think that the evidence that she presented for specifically like sexual assault beyond harassment are evidenced, but it does seem like there's good reason to believe that Joe Biden is probably like not a great respecter of women's boundaries by any means. So,
of birth. I was born a man, not my fault. I mean, I'll say I'm pretty happy about it, but it doesn't actually mean that I can't have an opinion on matters that affect other groups more than they affect me.
No. I totally agree with Ben here. Men should never speak. I think that before you speak, men should be turned into women. Actually, I think that what Joe Biden is doing is one of the biggest expansions of freedom of speech that the United States has ever seen. There's all these men who can't speak because they're at the bottom of the victimhood totem pole. What Joe Biden wants to do is take every man, force feminize them, and convert them into women, lifting them up on the totem pole. And now they will be able to speak again. Joe Biden is reforming speech culture in the United States to allow everyone to speak again. It's so incredibly based Biden, folks.
Because the entire basis of having any sort of republic is the idea that we can talk beyond those barriers, that we can have rational conversations with one another. Identity politics throws up a roadblock in the way of this. Identity politics prevents you from having these important conversations. The left is assaulting the right to bear arms, obviously. Now, the right to bear arms was specifically created and meant to protect you from tyranny. It wasn't meant for hunting. It wasn't meant for sport shooting. It was meant to protect you from tyranny and to prevent you from having your rights assaulted in your own home. The left has decided, however, that that's not really a threat, which leads to a really weird spectacle. The left proclaims that President Trump is Hitler or Stalin, but they want him to take all their guns.
Well, I hate this line. So the two things. One, I am generally a proponent of gun control. I am not, I don't like the more revolutionary part of the left. I don't think the left is going to rise up and seize the means of power. I generally refer people here to like Chenoweth and Stefan, that nonviolent resistance is very, very effective, whereas violent resistance seems to inspire, this is another study that I like to refer to called agenda seeding. It seems to seed the agenda for people to believe that protesters are violent. So in general, I'm not actually sure. From all the evidence that I've read, there's not a clear link between firearms and protecting freedoms. And there's an even more tenuous connection between like civilian firearm ownership and, I don't know, a successful leftist revolution in the first world, which there has never been one yet. And I have little reason to believe that widespread gun ownership is going to be the reason for it in the United States. So I don't actually agree that like guns are key to protecting tyranny. But I think that generally the leftists that want, not the leftists, the people who want to restrict gun control, who are like in the mainstream, are generally not those who want to like take away all of your guns. They just want to set specific limits on gun ownership. Like I think my specific advocacy is like, I want to mandate that everyone gets a license and like a permit so that we know that they're reasonably competent and we know that they're of reasonably sound mind so they won't kill themselves or others, hopefully. We want everyone to have a mandatory safe so that you have to have somewhere where you can lock up your gun, because the main source of where criminals get guns is by stealing it from civilian houses. The pipeline is basically civilian buys gun, puts it in their house, it gets stolen, now it's in the criminal market, and then the criminal uses the gun to hurt people. So if you want less criminal guns, you need to lock up the civilian guns in safes in their houses. Or more generally, reduce the supply of guns. So the third tenet to me is I would like to gradually over the long term try to like reduce the prevalence of gun ownership. Yeah, I don't know. There are some people who like want to take away guns, and I probably said sentiments to that effect in like previously. If I want to take away guns, it's on like the 200-year scale. My actual advocacy for what I want to see right now in the United States as it currently exists is like very moderate reforms. So I think this is just this is a sort of like, it's the sort of thing where the right will paint everyone who wants like a $15 minimum wage as a socialist. They will paint everyone who wants like expanded Medicare as a socialist. Similarly, they will paint everyone who wants like a little bit of gun control as someone who literally wants to take away your guns and thinks that guns don't matter. Joe fucking Biden thinks that guns are important to protecting freedom. He just wants less like death from it. There's literally some quote from Joe Biden where he was like, if someone's breaking into your house, take your 12 gauge shotgun and fire twice into the air. Like, I fucking hate this, man. Why can't they just address things one-to-one with what they're actually saying?
Which is a very weird response to Hitler or Stalin. The fact is that...
Oh, and the last thing you said is, Trump should run that agency. I think this is the classic argument, is that liberals don't want Trump to run that agency. They want an independent group of people to run that agency who are not politically compromised. They don't want people like Trump in that position of power in the first place. So, like... The problem here is exactly what Ben said at the beginning, that sometimes democracies can elect leaders who would take away your rights. If Trump genuinely wanted to take away your rights, I don't think that civilian gun ownership would really stop him from doing so. The United States military, if it were unified behind Trump, which it absolutely was not, but if it had been under a more competent fascist, I'm not sure that he would have been able to resist. No one else seems to have been.
If the left truly believed that Trump was all the things they say that he is, they would be very much in favor of the right to bear arms as a defense against the sort of tyranny that they specifically are afraid of. But the real truth is that the attempt to take away the right to bear arms is based on the idea that your individual rights can be quashed in the name of the collective, that there's a broader collective that has an interest in you not having a gun, and therefore your gun should be taken away, no matter how law-abiding you are.
Liberal.
Which is one of the weird things about gun control. Everybody, left, right, and center, agrees. We don't want people with severe mental illness having guns. We don't want people with...
Now, someone asked Ben Shapiro about how much funding he wants to give for mental illness programs.
criminal records having guns. We don't want people who are inherently dangerous having guns. It's only the left that suggests we want people who are fully law-abiding to have their guns taken away from them because somehow this is going to make society safer, which suggests perhaps there's an ulterior motive to the attempt to take away the
left wants to take away your guns so they can take away your freedoms.
Right to bear arms, and that is to remove obstacles between the government's control of human life.
Okay, well, I guess he got cut off in this very well-produced IDW clips. The basic idea that the left wants to remove your guns to reduce your rights is, I think, really interesting because it links directly into the idea of positive and negative freedoms. I think that most people on the left, this is certainly my approach. I think that a society where there are fewer guns, and therefore I think that because of that fewer gun crimes, is also one where your freedoms are more protected. Your right to personal safety and property is more preserved in a world where less people are going to kill you, in a world where less people are going to harm you. I think that fundamentally, from a positive rights perspective, this is one of those examples where restriction of the right to own guns could actually end up making you more free because you are free from getting shot. The CIA cut him off, yeah. The CIA doesn't respect freedom of speech anymore. The CIA gave the slot instead to a black LGBTQ woman because the CIA is just embedded. The CIA, like the rest of the deep state, is embedded with critical race theory and is trying to destroy the American values. All right, and with that, I'm probably going to get off. I'm going to play Minecraft with my sister, and it's going to be fun, because Minecraft is based.